bring two things to the conference. The first is the work I've been doing with Syrian refugees and Lebanon. The second is has been some work that I've been doing looking at risk assessment and the use of virtual reality for teaching risk assessment, so it'd be nice to have a chat afterwards. But for today's presentation, I'm going to talk through something which is more of a kind of parallel topic for the conference. It is something that I've actually used virtual reality footage within, and that's virtual student exchange. I'll talk a bit about the scenario that I use, because it's a scenario-based learning exercise. And trying to give you some of my personal experiences of the software and the tools that I've used whilst putting this together, which hopefully might be quite helpful for those that say they've trying to relearn the same things. And then once I completed this intervention, I did some student interviews. I recorded the footage, transcribed it, and carried out some thematic analysis. And so the last few slides of the presentation will be presenting the findings of that thematic analysis. So, should explain a little bit about where all of this came from. So we've had Panopto project at my university, and for those that aren't familiar with it, it's a piece of software which captures a video recording of the lecture, and it timestamps the recording based on where you are on the overhead slides in PowerPoint. It's very useful for students to go back over and quickly locate segments of the lecture they didn't understand, and to return to it when they're doing revision. So this has meant that pretty much every lecture theatre that we've got within the university now has video recording equipment and some pretty effective microphones, able to pick up anyone up to about the middle row in this room. So I was wondering how else I could use this. We then had a change in Vice-Chancellor at the university, and she brought in the Cardiff Met EDGE, which is obviously an acronym. It's Ethical, Digital, Global and Entrepreneurial. This is trying to bring out these qualities in our graduates, and so I was starting to think about what I could do in the way of making my graduates more globally aware and more global context to the things that I was teaching. So I teach public health for the purposes of this presentation, and so what I was thinking is trying to bring out a more internationally focused examples in my teaching. Then I got pulled in at last minute on an Erasmus visit to Lebanon, to Beirut. I visited an institution called the Modern University for Business and Science. Whilst I was over there, I was very interested in whether we would have the opportunity to do some shared working between our students and shared assignment work between our students in the public health programme there and the public health programme at my university, Cardiff Met. And spoke to various people. It all kind of died the death, and then the director of research for the university in Beirut went to Stanford University in California, and he got chatting with started working with a chap that wanted to do virtual student exchanges through their virtual learning platform. And so he thought, oh, I had this chat with this guy called Henry, and he was interested in doing this, and so this is how the project came about. So we needed a scenario to base our teaching around, and so I sat down with the programme director for the public health qualification over there in Beirut, and we looked at our different modules and came up with a scenario which would demonstrate the learning outcomes for a module we had on our UK degree and the module we had on the Lebanese degree. And this was around refugees. You know, we've got refugees in the UK, public health professionals graduating from the university or environmental health professionals in our other programme are going to be encountering refugee communities, and they've got a lot of quite involved public health needs, and they're a difficult client group to engage with. Well, we think we've got problems in the UK, but the problems that we've got in the Middle East for refugees are phenomenal. This is quite a poor source. It's actually quite a low estimate. There is as many as 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 of the population of Lebanon are refugees coming over from Syria. And they present all sorts of unique public health challenges, because the thing is, you put them in these camps which we see as the traditional tents, but whilst I was doing a separate project taking a group of students out to Jordan, which is a lot safer country to visit than Lebanon has been, then the problem I had was the Palestinian refugees which I encountered in Jordan had been there for over 50 years. And so they were living in very roughly built but concrete and brick structures with metal roofs, whereas they weren't living in these temporary camps. And so how do you put in infrastructure when you're not supposed to recognise the permanency of the occupation of the site that you're using? The scenario they've got in Lebanon is much more a patch of land that they'll rent off a farmer, and they produce some water piping there with untreated water, dig holes for latrine facilities, and then they just take huge segments of tarpaulin, put them over rough wooden frames, and that then becomes a unit of accommodation for a family, and all generations of the family will live within that. So these semi-permanent camps present some real tricky solutions for our undergraduates to try to work out, and it requires them to really do a lot of investigation to understand what the problems are. So I was trying to work out whether I could take my students over to do some of these visits to the camps in Lebanon, because their students go to this from the Modern University of Business and Science, and they do health days, and I thought, wow, what a fantastic learning experience for our students. But it was completely impossible. I mean, if we look at this map, anything you see that is orange on this map from the Foreign Commonwealth Office website is only essential travel, and anything that's red, which encompasses a large chunk of the country and where they do most of their health days, that's no travel at all. And my dean was fairly okay about this until he found out that there was no way I'd have any insurance if I went anywhere near one of these places, despite the fact the locals don't see any problem with this at all. They're quite happy taking their students and have done for years. And if you want to get an idea of how tricky this country can be, the little inset you see in the top left-hand corner there, that's actually the capital. Now, I was staying in a hotel in the north. In the south, the grey bit, forgive me, I'm colourblind, I think it's grey, is the airport. And when I did the risk assessment, I'm quite used to going to quite undeveloped countries or countries with problems. And I thought, how bad can this be? But I actually had to develop, in line with the local consulate's advice, a maritime rescue plan if the red patch, which is Hezbollah-controlled territory in the southern half of the capital, they rose up overnight, and I had to get myself from my hotel in the north to the airport in the south. So can I get students in this environment? Not a chance. Can I get myself in this environment for footage? Not a chance. So this was a perfect scenario to use virtual reality, because it wasn't just adding some kind of educational gimmick, which the students would recall more the intervention and not the content of the intervention. It's something which is putting the students somewhere where it's impossible to take them on a normal day. So what I want to do is use some dynamic experiential learning, have an opportunity to build capacity for the students through cooperation and get them used to using some of those interpersonal skills with unusual people when they come into working in practice in public health. I also want to try and break down some of the stereotypes. There's a lot of anti-Middle Eastern and Islamophobic sentiment is expressed indirectly or directly through our Western press. And so this area has a really bad name, and there's an awful lot of preconceptions in amongst our students. And to give them a dry run for tackling these sorts of issues when they get posed to them in future, so they get used to that sort of problem solving and thinking on the feet. So what did I do with them? Well, first week we got together a video conference with the lecture theatre in Lebanon, lecture theatre in Cardiff, and then we had the professionals dialing in from Stanford who kind of contributed and monitored what was going on. We got the students to do an icebreaker, so they got used to talking to each other through the medium of the software and the video conferencing. And then we broke them up into some preset groups. And so we had equal representation from Lebanon and from the UK students in each of these groups. Each group got one small subsection of the public health challenges you'd find in a refugee site. So sanitation, one looked at shelter, another one's looking at infectious disease control, and they had to go away and investigate it. And we got them to talk to each other through WhatsApp mainly, and we tried to get them to talk to each other through Skype. Week 2, we had them back for another video conference to touch base and make sure that they were doing plenty of research and they didn't just all fall by the wayside. And actually we found that the students had really picked this up and they run with it in their groups. And it had gone beyond just the communication on the topic. It actually started making friends and meeting their families and showing them around virtually. Week 3, we set them the assignment and our students had to come up with an interview protocol which the Lebanese students would then execute, their teammates would execute when they carried out a visit to a refugee camp in the north of Lebanon near the border. They worked a bit of sort of tennis to and froing as they developed the questionnaires, and then the Lebanese students visited the camp and they captured virtual reality footage. We're using a Samsung Gear, I believe, and that was put together, put on a file sharing site once I'd finally got them to stitch it together, and then I edited that into a film which our students could then view. So they viewed the footage and then listened to the results of some thematic analysis of the interview findings carried out by the Lebanese students when they visited the camp. So I wanted to use the virtual reality in this scenario to try to provide learning opportunities beyond the sort of abstract learning that we do through our predominantly scenario-based curriculum that we've got for both our degrees. And I thought it was much more effective to give them that direct experience rather than this simulated experience of pretend situations, however closely aligned they may be with real life ones they'll find on a day-to-day basis at work. I wanted to deepen the learning through the use of emotion, try and twang their heartstrings a little bit, and self-driven cognition of subject matter. And finally, I want to introduce a kind of metaphorical distance that our students had from the subject matter that they were learning about, so it became much more tangible to them. So, technology and a bit on the practice side, as promised. Time zones were an issue, not so much between us and the Middle East. So if you do choose to do any of this collaborative work, pick somewhere that's roughly in line with the UK. Great for communicating with Jordan, not so good for communicating with California, as I was half expecting them to appear at the video conference in their slippers with their cocoa, but credit to them, they were there fully suited and booted in a conference suite at 2 to 3 in the morning in Stanford, not looking remotely grumpy about it either. Our students really felt for them. I tried Cisco conferencing, our video conferencing suite, which was completely useless as they needed to have the right software version. We needed to test it. We then needed to make an interview room date, and it was just far too complex to set up. So we tried Cisco Jabber, which is kind of a Skype version of Cisco. You have to pay for it, but that provided a pretty stable connection. That worked brilliantly until the third video conferencing session when it fell flat and we came back to Skype. WhatsApp ruled above all others in getting students to interact virtually through synchronous or asynchronous communication inside the lecture theatre or outside the lecture theatre. It was much better than anything else we tried. edX is a Stanford learning platform, and we put all our materials on that. We did that partly because this was Stanford's wished for contribution, and partly because other platforms such as Blackboard and Moodle require you to have your students enrolled because they're attached to our registries. And this means that the students in the other university either become enrolled students in our university or they've got no chance of talking to each other. Now we've got a Met Connect, which is a version of our Moodle page which faces outwards, and you can do that with, but you still have to have a registration face, and it's so far not sufficiently smooth to be able to carry this sort of thing out. Finally, 360 cameras and viewers. Everything was done through Google Cardboard because I had a grand total of I think 480 quid of money off the university for all of my virtual reality work, and so everything had to be done on an absolute rock bottom budget. So I spent most of that on a Ricoh Theta 4K, which is an absolute rock star of a camera. It's fantastic. thoroughly recommend that, because with things like Samsung Gear, despite the fact it's high definition, it's 2K, when you stretch that over a photosphere, it looks pretty dodgy. So the 4K cameras that are coming through now, they are good enough. Kodak's PixPro is 2 separate cameras which you then put in a mount back to back. They're both 270 degrees and you stitch the images, but the stitching was atrocious and it looked awful. So I gave up on those, and we've recently got a Garmin and a GoPro, which are market leaders at the moment, but around 600 quid, so out of my price range. Someone else has got it, not me. Cardboard, as I say, was the way forwards because it was the easiest one to scale up. We did get some discomfort and motion sickness, and most of this was because the students who were capturing the footage for their teammates had had no prior training on using virtual reality cameras, 360 cameras, and so they were waving it about all over the place, putting in their armpit, holding it in dubious parts of their body, and it made it really quite difficult for the students over this side of the equation to understand what was going on, and also they felt quite unwell. So, interview findings. Sensory experience, after quite a detailed set of questions, the same videotapes the interviews. We can get an overall, so the students reported you get an overall view and see every part of what there is to see. And it was that every part of what there is to see that came out across the board with the students. So it captured every aspect of life, everything, the toilet, where they live, where they sleep, how they cook. You can see, this was a new one that I didn't expect, you can see the interviewers' reactions to the questions. So when you see one of these things, having that nice experience where you can look between the people that are talking and seeing that body language, but also when they point at something, you can then look down there and see what they're pointing at. It feels like being in the refugee camp, so it felt like they were in the midst of them, so I satisfied my objective of getting the students closer to what it was that they were learning about. Virtual reality allows viewers to feel the reality of the refugees, so it's not emotions, that's feeling the reality of the people that they're looking at, that they're trying to investigate. And you can usually only get that when you're speaking with someone face to face, and so that really spoke a lot for us in the use of the virtual reality to get that across. Students learned that from direct experience of the subject matter. I perceived it because it was like there with them, we're there with them. The students weren't experiencing a simulation or an abstract version of it, they were experiencing it directly, and because they were involved in the structuring of the questionnaires, they were there was much more structured involvement with the environment that they were viewing rather than a passive viewing of something that had been captured at some point in the past. Students' emotions were affected. So I succeeded in another one of my aims, to twang those heartstrings. And actually this is something, the quotes are pretty good. Having that one latrine there, that hole that they dig in, it's a really terrible. But actually something that I witnessed whilst I was watching them viewing the footage using the headset. The students were really, some of them were quite elated and they were enjoying the experience, but then you watched as they sort of went home what they were looking at and what these people were going through and the way they were living, and you can see that it really caught them in their heart. And so this led on to another question, which is how could this then be used for public health, to increase the impact of public health issues, making that more tangible through the use of virtual reality. Did the students think that it could be used in this way to help to publicise for charitable means, or to disseminate information, or through the purposes for documentaries, as mentioned this morning? And the students all agreed that that was something that was really a use for this software. Finally, I quite like this one, completely unexpected. The 360 video was seen as being a much more honest way of seeing something. So the students described that if you saw a 2D video camera, because we asked them to say, here's your 3D, here's your 2D, how do you think it was different? Or would be different if you view this in 2D? And they said that it was with the 2D image, the camera controlled you and what you see. Whereas with the 360 degree image, you control what you see. The camera is a secondary issue with this, where it's pointing. And it can be distorted in any other form apart from in this 360. So it's seen as a very honest way of depicting what it was that they were looking at. So, last slide. The interview findings, we've gone through some physical symptoms. We did get some motion sickness and headaches, as I've described. The mobile phone mounts are a bit uncomfy for those with the bigger phones or with glasses. But despite that, every one of the students was involved wanted to use virtual reality again. And actually a common theme that came out of all of the interviews was that they were very keen for the students to, other students to experience what they'd gone through. And they were like the fact that they could be part of that. So that's the end of my findings. That's me done for my presentation. Any questions?
Okay, we've got time for questions. So, any questions? Okay.
One of the things that struck me about today is sort of the ethical dimension of things. Is there, or did you get back from students, the possibility of issues with tourism, as in poverty tourism, that they're watching this kind of like suffering taking place, and their suffering is slight dizziness, what they're doing in the UK? Is that in one of the considerations or not?
So the question was about, for our virtual attendants, the question was about whether you get any ethical issues around poverty tourism associated with the interaction with these images. Something that we did have to do quite considerable groundwork for was getting the compliance of the people in the refugee camp to be filmed in such an embarrassing scenario for them, and that was the bulk of the ethics side of it. That was eventually resolved by the fact that the university was going to do one of their health days there, and so the feedback that came back when we communicated with the head of the camp was that they were happy for this to occur and for people to see them in this context, if there was some tangible benefit for them. But for them in the refugee camps, the thing that they got fed up with was people coming, Western researchers, and poking and prodding, taking interview findings, etc., and then vanishing off to do goodness knows what with it, and they got no benefit from it. So if they saw that there was some kind of pro to them engaging with this, then they were okay with that. And we had to make sure that it wasn't just the head of the camp saying the members in the camp, you will do this and these people will come around and film you. It was a staged approach where they knew where the camera was going to be, they knew where they could stand not to be in images, so we had a lot of communication there because some of them were unhappy with being filmed. And then we asked again on entry to some of the tents in order to get permission to see the inside of the dwellings. And it did mean that you got a rather more sanitised view of what went on there, because everything was, of course, immaculately tidy, and only the nicest tents in the village were seen with, there was a couple of big TVs and things like that. So you didn't capture the true picture. So we did cause some bias to what we were finding. From the ethics side of things for our home students, because it was done purely for public health in an educational context, it picked up a lot of our health, our sort of poverty tourism issues. But if the images were made more freely available, that would certainly be an issue. So it was a matter of how you control the access to those images. And in the end, the camp participants were having seen the benefit of what was going on and seeing the way it was being. So the fact that it wasn't harmful to them, they were quite happy for those images to be shared more widely. But the students at home, the ethics side of things was also, I don't know if I did get to the bottom of this one, was how to, where you've got someone that might have some pre-existing predisposition for motion sickness and such like, how do you deal with that ahead of time? And I think I mainly just dealt with that by saying warnings. You may feel a bit rough after you've done this. Thank you, good question.
Well, so you said that you gave reviews of cameras, and you said they use VR gear, didn't they? Was the one that actually used for the video.
So the question was, which camera do they use? They use the gear, yeah.
They use the gear. And so the question was asked, so they did the gear, so the gear stabilisation is terrible, so I presume that's why there was a lot. Was the motion sickness from the way you said they were waving the camera around, was that? So I've seen from the, I don't know if you saw the other guy's demo earlier when he was using an Insta, it was more stable. I just found that then I was wondering if that might have been the main reason for the motion sickness, or was it because it was just a headset design and stuff?
Okay, so fundamentally the question was it the camera that caused motion sickness and the lack of image stability? I've been experimenting with using a gimbal to take images with my nice shiny Ricoh Theta. The Samsung was a problem because you had untrained users and you had to find someone with a steady hand, and once you got their footage it was like, right, just leave the camera with them. So the problem was you only find out that after they've taken all the footage, so we had to scrap tons of it to get a small amount of effective stuff. But anything that involved moving cameras caused motion sickness, because we retook the images but it was too late to use them using a series of stills, and then I edited those so the stills were still moving footage, but the characters were moving around the camera and the camera moved from location to location as a series of stills. That was the only thing that solved it in the end.
The other question I would recommend, just as a statement, look at the Insta one and see what they've done, because they put out test shots of them attaching it to dogs and running around, so the dog is not keeping stable, and you can watch it. It's perfectly watchable because of the new stabilisation software. What I'd like to talk to you, the question I'd like to ask you now is what you're talking about relates to something we've worked on, which is remote engineering. So you're talking about remote health so basically fitness. And I wonder, as the world becomes more connected and there's more internet out there, and these technologies become better and the streaming technologies become better, is that something which you think could actually be used on a live consultancy basis, where 360 cameras are sent into red zones, with local representatives to then, to get better access to higher quality, in our case engineers, in your case health scientists, to get more done?
So for virtual attendance, the question is, could we use this in engineering or other instances to try to capture better quality images and data for those consulting on these issues from afar? And my answer to that is overwhelmingly yes. With mobile phone footage, so mobile phone Wi-Fi hookup for most of these cameras, and the capability of internet I found in most locations, it's very easy to dump files onto file sharing sites and then to access them. The only step that's involved there, and the software was dependent on the camera that you use. The Ricoh Theta, the software is free and universally accessible, whereas the Samsung Gear, the professional, the IT help over there couldn't understand how to stitch the images together, and so I had a long delay and all sorts of aggro trying to get that across to them. So for that sort of thing, it does depend on freely available software to be able to manipulate the images where you've got a lot of computer power around and it's easy to do so. But I see this as being an ideal use for that sort of thing. I also see it as being an excellent use for anything where you can get a person out there to gather the footage. My thought for this is whether there's the option for us to share some of our footage that we've gathered through YouTube and similar environments, so that we've got not just one academic like me running around trying to capture all the footage myself. For every one item of footage we can get 10 back. I think that's something where we need to be doing a bit more cooperative work. Thank you.
So I'm going to just make an observation. Oh,
just a very silly question maybe. A lot of these things, it's the rich West going out to understand and empathise with the poor people of the world. Is there any mileage in something going back the other way, so that they can maybe empathise with people in the West who aren't all xenophobic, racists, bastards, but actually do empathise with them? Is there anything that ever goes back the other way for them to show how we live and view them?
So the question was, is there anything which goes in the other direction rather than the West coming and getting involved with poorer or more challenged communities abroad? Is there anything going the other way? And the flip side, which I'm hoping to do in the next iteration of this virtual exchange, is to make the scenario that they look on a Western scenario. and Westerners, us dealing with possibly refugees in our country. And that way they'll be picking up the ethics side of things. The benefit of the scenario, I would say, was probably more towards the UK students, whereas if we flip it in the other direction, we still get the same benefits for a lot of our students, but they get to get that real insight into how the West works and they're dealing with these problems. And because they've got much more experience of dealing with these refugees directly, they're the ones that can then start putting forward really good suggestions for us about how we can go about doing things, because they're the ones who've been dealing with this much more effectively than we are doing now. Thanks for the question. Good question.
So, yeah, so I was just going to make an observation really that watching this and other talks, it's clear, and I think this was picked up earlier in our talk, how much support we're going to start to need in institutions to help the pioneers achieve what they want to achieve. And already we've seen there lots of different, and this is something I wrestle with, loads of different alternatives to do things in different ways. And almost you have to be kind of a technical mind person to wade through all of that, as well as design teaching interventions and these sorts of things. And it's just coming really clearly to me that that's something that really needs to be talked about, maybe a theme that we need to discuss again at some point. So, well, I think that was a great talk, shall we?
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.